You mentioned circling back to a piece that I recently wrote on a forgotten color revolution in Kyrgyzstan.
Yes.
So I think that we'll just rattle through that quickly, because I do think
Yes.
that it has an enormous relevance to where we've gotten to today in every way, which is that in the early, just as a bit of background for viewers
Please.
who are,
I didn't know anything about
are
this, by the way, and this was a
yeah,
damn good article.
thank you very much, Jamal. But yeah, the wider history here is October 5th marked the 25th anniversary of the world's first color revolution in Yugoslavia, and it was the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA front, USAID, Soros, and also the British. They effectively pulled off a soft coup to get rid of the Yugoslav leader, Slobodan Milosevic. And it was something that they celebrated. They boasted about it in the media. They made a documentary voiced by Martin Sheen, I think, called "Bringing Down a Dictator," about Milosevic's fall from power. Now, anyway, the techniques that were used to get rid of him have been used over and over and over again in what are known as color revolutions. Now, initially, the US was very keen to promote factors doing this, and you can find mainstream media reports in The Guardian, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, which often document in forensic detail how these color revolutions were pulled off in 2003 in Georgia, in what's known as the Rose Revolution, in 2004 in Ukraine, in what's known as the Orange Revolution. Now, the Maidan coup in 2014 in Ukraine was likewise, sponsored by the CIA, the USAID, NED, the British, Soros, every intelligence front foundation going. But this is, of course, now denied by Ukraine ultras and the mainstream media. But I think that in terms of the template for what happened in Maidan, a much better guide is the least well-known initial color revolution, which happened in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And it was called the Tulip Revolution. Now, the parallels between the Tulip Revolution and Maidan are quite similar. So in Kyrgyzstan, you had a popular and a legitimately elected leader called Askar Akayev, who was pro-Western, I might add, and was very much open to doing business with the West and and all the rest. He presided over a system of governance which, while far from perfect, it was the freest, most open, and most stable country in the region. At that time, its neighbors like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan were these brutal dictatorships that were heavily involved in the CIA's extraordinary rendition program, where terror suspects were savagely tortured and in some cases killed. But anyway, that's by the by. The point is that the Tulip Revolution, it kicked off in the traditional way via NGOs, civil society groups, and opposition media, rallying vast mobs to cause havoc on the streets. Now, the protests were extremely violent, but the violence was completely one-sided. Like the security services under Akayev, they didn't fight back. They didn't brutally crack down on protesters. They tried to limit the violence at most, while these brick and stick wielding thugs smashed up buildings, forcibly occupied government headquarters, etc. A similar dynamic played out in Maidan, where they were violent from the very start, but the what all that Western audiences were shown was the response of police to that violence, and it was framed as, oh, this is the evil, Russian-backed Ukrainian Putin puppets, like beating up innocent, defenseless student protesters, and that was the narrative, and it was heavily informed by what happened in Uzbekistan, where there was, a legitimately elected government was basically overthrown by a bunch of violent thugs, and then this was framed as a victory for people power and the dawning of a new era of democracy and freedom and blah blah blah. And then subsequent to this, Kyrgyzstan became under the rule of the West hand-picked puppet Kerman Bakayev. It became a absolutely savage, corrupt dictatorship where murder and false imprisonment and torture of opposition journalists, activists, and politicians became like completely routine. And Bakayev, enriched himself, his family, via corrupt deals with the US and other Western powers. And so I think that that actually, it's kind of a similar dynamic to Maidan, and we see where that has gotten us, which is upwards of 1 million Ukrainians dead.
It's effective. I mean, it's like, if you think about it, it's a very effective strategy. Like, we've had Brian Miletic on the show, and Brian was talking about this need for maintaining not just your military, but also your media space, like your ability to control. God, this sounds horrible when you say it. And to me, it sounds horrible as an American, right? Just because we have a First Amendment, and this kind of goes against the main thought process in the way that we operate in the United States. But this idea of being able to control your media space. And it screws with me to say that. Every time when Brian makes that argument, it messes with me, because in the US, what that means is we are going to have a ministry of truth, and we are going to ensure that the public gets certain information, and we're going to make sure that the public doesn't get other information. And we are going to try to control the narrative as that narrative functions. Okay, well, these people lie, right? These people make stuff up all the time. Russia blew up its own pipeline. Oh, it's unprovoked war of aggression. It's, calling a genocide as anti-Semitic. Like, these are the narratives that they would want to instill into the American population, and they would want to control social media and the media space in order to instill those narratives. So it screws with me with this idea of controlling your media space. But he kind of has a point. If you don't, what you end up with is something that looks like Ukraine, or you get something that looks like Kyrgyzstan, or you get something that looks like, I don't know, Yugoslavia at the point, well, as you pointed out, Slobodan Milosevic, where NGOs are on the ground, and you have all of this media that's paid back. When Trump kind of got rid of USAID and NED, he didn't really get rid of it. They put it in the State Department. But when he's pulled back the money from it, 90% of the media in Ukraine was effectively paid by USAID. And then you get all of these media organizations all throughout Europe, where it's like 80%, if not more, were effectively being paid from the United States, coming out of our coffers. And they would call themselves independent media, even though the money that they're getting is largely from the United States. Okay, well, what does that look like in a country, right? If you have another country that is effectively putting out narratives and stories in your own media for the best interest of our country. So I understand the argument. Like Georgia's a really good example, where the French spy, the spook from France, who's president of Georgia, did everything in her power to assist violent protests to overthrow the government of Georgia. And when Georgia said, well, we need a FARA law, the United States has a FARA law, by the way. And when they said we need a FARA law, Europe freaks out. It's like, why are you freaking out about a law for us to understand who's putting money into our politics and who's putting money into our media? Well, it's kind of obvious, right? You're freaking out because you're putting a huge amount of money into NGOs, into media, and everything else to help overthrow the government, to create a second front against Russia. Like, so it's a very effective way of going about trying to overthrow a government, because if you are let's say the US or some other country, you could say, hey man, there seems to be a popular uprising. Missing the fact of all the money that went into that quote unquote popular uprising against the government. It's effective. It's effective. Georgia was successful in beating it back, but that's only because they had the example of Ukraine and probably the example of Kyrgyzstan or some other countries where they've seen it play out. Can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I'm muted. Sorry about that. But no, absolutely. And I think, well, I mean, Georgia, yes, itself was the site of a like I mentioned, it was the first color revolution after they got rid of Milosevic. But it's like, they have beaten back multiple attempts to overthrow them like recently, and it's like, I think that they are providing a very clear blueprint for how you respond to this stuff, which is number one, make foreign organizations operating in your territory disclose their funding by law or face shutdown. It's a basic it should be a basic requirement everywhere. And in my neck of the woods, the former Yugoslavia, there is a website called Balkan Insight, which nobody I know locally reads. Everybody thinks it's like MI6 CIA propaganda. But it is a very effective way of shaping narratives. It relentlessly, for instance, demonizes Russia. It relentlessly demonizes the Chinese. It has published many distorted or completely false stories about both and their involvement in the Balkans, which and then the value of that is quite clear, because then the New York Times will report on what Balkan Insight has claimed, saying an independent outlet in the Balkans. Well, then you mean, there's like a CIA MI6 propaganda platform, which nobody locally takes seriously. Like they don't have a print copy, but if they did, people would use it for laboratorial purposes. Let's put it that way. But yeah, I think that I mean on the one hand, yes, that Georgia's success in beating back this stuff is to be celebrated. I think at the same time, like, this threat has gone nowhere. Like in Nepal, we saw at the start of September, the overthrow of the elected government there. It had all the hallmarks of a color revolution. It would, and there is now a political vacuum in Nepal. What will fill that? I don't know. I wish the absolute best for Nepalese, and I'm sure that there were people who had legitimate grievances. But the fact of the matter is, color revolutions always harness legitimate grievances and then replace failed governments with something even worse. Each and every time this happens, it's that there is an article, I think it's from 2012, in Foreign Policy magazine, which is like this elite, imperial journal, where they talk about the color revolutions and how they were of the early 2000s in Yugoslavia, Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, and they said each one was a total disaster. Like a total disaster, which it led to the election of brutal rulers who had their opponents killed. It impoverished local populations. In many cases, it's taken these countries, decades to get back to where they were before this happened. If at all. I think that we need to remain vigilant. Particularly now, where I think that there's a lot of talk about the US pulling back from Asia and perhaps ending its hostile stance on China. I'm not really seeing any sign of that myself, I must admit. But at the same time, it's like, well, in that context, if they can't win militarily, then they're still going to be pumping untold sums into propaganda. They're still going to be funding civil society groups. They're still going to be, teaching people in the art of wreaking havoc and causing chaos. We need to be really careful. I have an article forthcoming on leaks from the Open Society Foundation, which is run by George Soros. Bearing in mind that when George Soros' son Alex, I believe his name Alzheimer's took over the running of this, he said, we're going to fund less civil society projects. These documents like openly state that they want to end the rule of elected president pro bono at all
Really?
costs. And they lay out various different means of doing so. So, I mean, they've not given this stuff up.
Really?
It's devastating. It's devastatingly effective. So why would you stop doing it?
Wow. Yeah, it's funny. Well, as you mentioned, Nepal, I am in Nepal as we speak. I was just in Indonesia, so apparently they're trying to get rid of the governments that I'm visiting. But, well, he went to Trump.
That's quite suspicious, Jamal.
I know, right?
Like,
It's funny.
An accidental tourist. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm sorry.
What's wild about that? I was here 18 years ago when they removed the king from Nepal, when the parliament effectively made the king leave. And I jumped in this time around. I had a conversation with my host, and he pointed out, he says, he said, when he found out I did the channel, he was like, so what did you think of the protests? And then, of course, right, you have to respond to it. I said, well, look, two things were at work. I said, in one sense, there's a belief that you guys had honest, like had legitimate reasons to be pissed off.
Yeah.
And in the other sense, you guys were being maneuvered. Both were taking place at once. He says, look, they murdered 19 kids here. So you had children that was at the protests. He said they were still in their uniforms. 19 of them were murdered by the cops. And he said people lost it. He said they went ballistic. And at that point, all bets were off. They started burning down parliamentary buildings. They started burning down houses. But they were burning down locations that were related to the people that were effectively in power, that had anything to do with the decisions that was being made. At a certain point, the cops stopped shooting. Effectively, the cops were like, we're not getting involved.
Yeah.
In which case, the government falls. And as I pointed out to him, I said, yeah, but, there seemed to be a lot of money that was in that coming from the U.S. also in order to kind of affect agenda. And who's going to take power? Or the person who took power after that, is that person going to continue with the Belt and Road? Is that person going to continue with the relationship with China? Like, what does the politics look like immediately after the protests? And now, all things being equal, from their point of view, we were legitimately pissed off.
Yeah.
And as you point out, they often have legitimate reasons for being pissed off when those protests are taking place. So,
yeah, well, that's the thing, is that I never want to diminish, the individual agency of protesters abroad, and it's like, that so often, people do have legitimate grievances, and they want something better. Although it's like, there was an interesting, I believe it was Washington Post, or it might have been the New York Times. They're just indivisible in my head at this point. But there was a report on September, like after the interim government led by Karki, who has a pretty badass revolutionary history, it must be said, as does her husband, who hijacked an airplane to steal money to fund an insurgency against the monarchy. Anyway, the point is that the New York Times noted, well, Nepalese have overthrown a system they fought so hard to install, by getting rid of the monarchy, and they don't have a sense of what comes next, and that's when it gets problematic. Because as it used to be openly stated on the USAID's own website, we exploit windows of opportunity.
right.
And a government falling is a very obvious window of opportunity. And it's like, as I say, the best will in the world to the Nepalese. I wish them a bright, happy future. But be extremely careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
By the same token.
Yeah, I feel you on that one. Power vacuums are always problematic, right? Kit, man, I have enjoyed this conversation like nobody's business. I always enjoy when you come on. The audience love you. I always love to talk to you. I think we have
my pleasure always. Kit absolutely.
Klarenberg. And by the way, I'm going to put your article below so the audience can read it for themselves. As I point out, it's a very good article. You do damn good work, and I learn something anytime. always say the highest honors. Say you learn something in an interview, or you learn something when you're reading something that somebody writes, and that was a damn good article. Kit Klarenberg, he's an investigative journalist documenting the role of intelligence services in shaping politics perceptions. You can find Kit's work on global delinquents, the Gray Zone UK, and he also has work on the Gray Zone proper in and of itself. This started off very awkwardly, but hopefully, I don't have control over my guest thoughts. And God, you have no idea how many times I've run into issues where guests clash and conflict, and I don't know how to work that problem. It's like,
maybe don't see it as a problem. Diversity of opinion is very important, and talking to people who you disagree with is something that I am very keen on, and it's something that I try and do on my own show, Decline and Fall. Shameless plug. But it's like I didn't take his comments personally. I just thought it was quite an ironic kind of lead in to me appearing.
Yeah.
But on that note, God bless you, Jamal. Take care, my friend, and thanks for having me on. Take care.
Absolutely, man. You be safe. Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Shout out to Kit. Kit is